It was a normal Tuesday evening, the kind where the streets hum quietly with the pulse of a city settling into its routine. But for Marcus Harper, District Attorney of Montgomery County, this evening would change everything. What started as a simple traffic stop would quickly spiral into something that exposed the deepest fractures in the system he had spent his career fighting to uphold. As the flashing lights appeared behind him, Marcus knew something was wrong. He wasn't speeding. His registration was up to date. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. Yet the moment those sirens blared, a cold, familiar feeling settled in his chest. The price of being black in America was higher than most people realized. And tonight, Marcus was about to pay it. Marcus took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road. He didn't speed up or act erratically. Instead, he kept his movements deliberate, slow, and controlled. He knew how quickly things could escalate, especially when an officer didn't like the way a black man responded. As the police car came to a stop behind his vehicle, Marcus made sure to keep his hands on the steering wheel. His training kicked in. Keep calm. Don't give them a reason to escalate. The officer approached the car, his flashlight cutting through the dark, shining directly into Marcus' eyes. The beam was harsh, unforgiving, felt invasive, intentional. The officer was a middle-aged white man, his uniform neatly pressed, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet Marcus immediately, just leaned down to peer into the car. "License and registration, please," the officer said flatly. Marcus reached over to the glove compartment and handed the documents to the officer. He didn't say anything, just watched the officer carefully. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his tone a bit more sharp than necessary. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't been weaving in and out of lanes. He wasn't under the influence. So why? "No, officer. I'm not sure why." "Well, you made an illegal lane change a few blocks back," the officer replied, his voice edging with something Marcus couldn't quite place. Was it hostility? Disdain? Marcus' mind raced. He didn't remember making any lane changes. He had followed the traffic rules just like any other day. But in that moment, something about the way the officer was speaking, his posture, his demeanor, felt off. "I didn't make a lane change, officer," Marcus said cautiously. "I've been following the traffic laws. Could you show me where I made the violation?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Marcus, his expression hardening. Did the officer not believe him? "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," the officer ordered, his voice now tinged with an almost calculated authority. Marcus froze. He didn't move. The officer's order felt wrong, excessive for something as minor as a lane change. But what could he do? What should he do? He knew all too well the consequences of pushing back against a police officer, especially when he had no idea what this officer was capable of. But Marcus was a man of principle, and that principle told him that he had every right to ask why. "Can you tell me why you're asking me to step out of the car?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated. Then he looked down at his radio, as if calculating something. "I said, get out of the car," the officer repeated, more forcefully now. Marcus' heart raced. This was escalating, and he needed to stay in control. He had seen too many stories on the news, too many incidents where the situation turned violent quickly. This couldn't be one of those times. He had to stay calm. "I'm going to stay in the car unless you give me a valid reason," Marcus responded, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer's face twisted into something resembling anger, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped the side of his holster, his hand hovering for a moment. The tension was suffocating. It happened in an instant. One moment, Marcus was sitting in his car, trying to keep the situation from spiraling. The next moment, the officer's hand was on his door, pulling it open without warning. "I told you to get out of the car," the officer barked, his tone now dripping with aggression. Marcus recoiled slightly, his breath catching in his chest. But he didn't move, he couldn't. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was an assault on his dignity. For a moment, the officer seemed to sense the hesitation. And then, without another word, He yanked Marcus out of the car, his arm gripping Marcus' elbow roughly. "Let go of me," Marcus said through clenched teeth. He was the district attorney. He had rights. The officer tightened his grip, dragging Marcus a few feet away from the car. The movement felt invasive, humiliating. "I said, let go of me. What is this? What are you doing?" Marcus demanded. "I'm going to search you, smart guy," the officer muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. Marcus' heart raced in his chest. The officer was trying to provoke him, push him into a reaction. He couldn't fall for it. Not this time. But then the officer did something Marcus didn't expect. He glanced at the papers in his hand again, his eyes narrowing when he saw the name. Marcus Harper, District Attorney. The officer stepped back, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Wait, you're the District Attorney." Marcus exhaled sharply, finally standing tall. This was his moment. This was why he had worked so hard to build a reputation for fairness, for justice. It wasn't just his title, it was his right to be treated with dignity. "Yes, I am the District Attorney," Marcus said, his voice steady now. "And you've just assaulted a public official without cause. I demand your badge number. This will go straight to the police chief." The officer blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected this. For a brief moment, his face flushed with the realization of what he'd just done. But there was no going back. The damage had already been done. The officer, now visibly flustered, backed away, mumbling something inaudible. He suddenly seemed unsure of himself. Marcus stood there for a moment, still seething, still processing what had just happened. This wasn't just a violation of his rights. This was a systematic issue. How many black men had gone through this before? How many had faced the same unjust treatment simply for existing in a car, minding their business? "I'm going to report this," Marcus said again, his voice shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger. And then something unexpected happened. The officer stepped forward again, his demeanor now completely different. He dropped his shoulders, looked down, and said quietly, "Look, I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." For a brief second, Marcus considered the officer's words. Did it really matter? Was he supposed to feel relieved that the officer recognized his status? Or was the mere fact that the officer had acted this way in the first place enough of an indictment? "It doesn't matter who I am," Marcus said firmly. "What matters is how you treat people. And I'm done being treated like this." With those words, Marcus pulled out his phone and started recording the officer. The tension in the air was palpable, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. As the officer stepped back, still stammering, Marcus turned toward his car, his phone still recording, the lights flashing in the rearview mirror. But as he prepared to drive off, a voice crackled through his phone. A message from his colleague at the district attorney's office. "Marcus, you need to see this. There's more going on here than you know. They're watching you." His blood ran cold. Who was they? And how far did this corruption really go? As Marcus drove away, his mind raced. The encounter with the officer was just the beginning. There were deeper connections, darker forces at play. And now he was going to have to face them head-on. The night had left Marcus restless. He tried to sleep, tried to shake off the tension that still gripped his chest. The officer's face flashed in his mind, the harsh tone of his voice, the authority he'd used to push Marcus around as if he was just another black man who could be controlled. But Marcus wasn't just any man. He was the district attorney. He had spent his career making sure people who abused their power faced consequences. Yet, here he was powerless in the face of an unjust system. He had been right to record the interaction. At least, that's what he told himself. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if it was just a reflex or something deeper. The knowledge that the power he had worked so hard to earn might not be enough to protect him. The next morning, as Marcus sat down to breakfast, he pulled up the footage from his phone. The officer's face was clear, his movements sharp, the intimidation palpable. He played it back again, looking for something, anything that might explain the officer's actions. Was it personal? Did the officer know who he was? The officer hadn't seemed to recognize Marcus until after the confrontation started. It was only then that the officer backed off, realizing he was dealing with someone who had authority, someone who couldn't be easily intimidated. But that didn't explain why Marcus had been stopped in the first place. Was this just bad luck? Or was there more at play? Marcus had always believed in the justice system. He had spent his career upholding the law, prosecuting criminals, and ensuring that the people who broke the law were held accountable. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the system wasn't as fair as he had once believed. The encounter with Officer Hayes wasn't just an isolated incident. Marcus had seen the statistics. Police brutality against black men was real. So were the racial biases that ran rampant through law enforcement. But this wasn't just about his race. This was about abuse of power and the officer's actions. His refusal to acknowledge Marcus as a fellow human being, his immediate assumption that Marcus was guilty without cause, felt like a symptom of a much larger issue. Yes, I'm sure, Marcus's voice was steady, but inside, he was starting to question his every move. Marcus didn't have to wait long for the information to come back. Sarah's email came through that afternoon. The first few lines were just routine background checks, standard stuff, but then came the part that made Marcus' blood run cold. Officer Hayes has been involved in multiple complaints of racial profiling. His previous stops have included individuals of color, but curiously, none of these incidents have led to formal investigations. The officers who worked with him have reported strange behavior, but no official complaints were ever filed. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was it. The officer had been involved in more than just one instance of racial profiling. The department had ignored it, swept it under the rug. He had been allowed to continue harassing people of color with no consequences. And now Marcus realized something else. The system wasn't just broken. It was complicit. The next lines in the report hit harder than the first. Interestingly, Hayes is rumored to have connections within the city's political circles. He's been seen at various events with members of the city council and other local political figures. It's unclear how far his influence extends. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the implications starting to hit him. This wasn't just about an officer with a vendetta. This was about a network, a system of people protecting each other, people who had the power to control the narrative and silence anyone who questioned their actions. Hayes wasn't just an isolated incident. He was part of the system, a cog in a machine that kept minorities, especially black people, on the outside. And Marcus realized he was in deeper than he thought. The more Marcus dug, the more questions arose. It wasn't just the officer's file. It was the entire system, the city council, the police unions, and the internal politics that had shielded Hayes for years. The truth was far bigger than a single officer's misconduct. As Marcus compiled evidence, he began to realize that this wasn't just about race or profiling. It was about power, the ability to control who gets protected and who gets punished. The city, the courts, and law enforcement were all intertwined, with no one questioning the corrupt practices that had become embedded in their systems. Marcus knew he had to act, but who could he trust? The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fight became. As the district attorney, he had access to a great deal of power. But now, Marcus started to wonder, was that power just another tool of oppression? The deeper he went, the more he found his own integrity being tested. If he kept digging, would he expose the truth or become the next target? Weeks passed as Marcus navigated a web of lies, corruption, and fear. He spoke to community leaders, to activists, and even to other officers who had seen the same things he had, the systemic abuse, the way the law protected its own. He started to piece together a case that would expose more than just Officer Hayes. But the night before he was set to meet with his team to present the evidence, Marcus received another call. "Marcus, you need to be careful. I've been hearing whispers. There's a target on your back now. You've stepped into something much bigger than just this officer. You're not just going up against Hayes. You're going up against the whole system." It was his colleague Sarah again, but this time her voice was shaky. "You've got to stop before it's too late." But it was too late for that. Marcus couldn't stop now. He was already too far in. The day of the meeting, Marcus stood in his office, looking out the window, lost in thought. He had all the evidence, everything he needed to bring down Officer Hayes and the system that allowed him to continue his reign of terror. But as he picked up his phone, his hand trembled. The moment he pressed send, he knew there was no going back. He was about to put everything on the line. But then his phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake. If you go public with this, you'll regret it. The city won't protect you anymore. You're not the DA anymore, Marcus. You're just another target." Marcus' breath caught in his throat. He looked at the message and felt the weight of the words press down on him. Marcus sat in his office late one night, staring at the computer screen in front of him. The stack of files on his desk felt heavier than it ever had before. He'd always been a man of conviction, a prosecutor who believed in justice, no matter the cost. But this was different. The investigation he had initiated after his altercation with Officer Hayes had revealed something even more horrifying than he anticipated. It wasn't just Hayes. It was a network of police officers, corrupt officers who were protected by a web of political influence, money, and fear. A system that systematically overlooked the abuse of power and pushed down anyone who dared to speak up. What started as a simple confrontation on the side of the road had turned into something much more dangerous. Marcus had unearthed years of racial profiling, unjust harassment, and corruption within the local law enforcement. What was worse, the very politicians he had worked with for years were now involved, complicit in maintaining the status quo. Marcus had to expose this, but doing so would cost him everything he had worked for. His career, his reputation, his life. But what was the alternative? To stay silent? No, he couldn't. Not after what he had seen. Not after being humiliated on the side of the road. The city he had sworn to protect was rotten to the core, and it was time for him to fight back. The next day, Marcus gathered his team of trusted colleagues. Sarah, a brilliant investigator who had been with him for years, looked at the piles of evidence on his desk and then back at him. "You know what this is going to mean, right? This isn't just going to affect your career, it's going to affect everything. The entire city will know. The officers, the politicians. They'll all come for you." Marcus knew this. He had already prepared himself for the consequences. But what he hadn't expected was just how deeply the corruption ran. "I know, but it has to be done. If we don't do something, we'll be complicit too." Marcus's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. Fear of the truth, perhaps, but also fear of what would happen if no one spoke up. As the investigation unfolded, Marcus's worst fears were realized. Officer Hayes had been the tip of the iceberg, a pawn in a much larger game. The network of corrupt officers had been operating in the shadows for years. They had been using their badge as a weapon, harassing and silencing those who dared to question them. It was clear now, this was bigger than just a bad cop. Just when Marcus thought the situation couldn't get any more complicated, an unexpected ally came forward, someone he hadn't anticipated. Officer Ben Sullivan, a rookie cop who had been working under Hayes and was fed up with the system. Sullivan had reached out to Marcus, his voice shaky but determined, explaining that he had witnessed Hayes' abuse firsthand. He had seen the officer harass civilians, falsify reports, and intimidate witnesses. But Sullivan was afraid to speak up. He knew the consequences of crossing someone like Hayes. But now he was ready to expose it all. "I can't live with myself anymore, man. You've got to know the truth. We can't let these guys get away with it. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything." Sullivan's voice was urgent, trembling with the weight of his decision. Marcus's heart raced as he listened. This was a game changer. The testimony of an officer who had seen the corruption firsthand could bring down Hayes and his network, could change everything. But as the night dragged on, Marcus realized that Sullivan's decision had put both of them in a dangerous position. They weren't just up against Hayes anymore. They were up against the entire city's power structure. Marcus spent the next few days in careful planning, contacting trusted allies in law enforcement and the media. They couldn't let this investigation go public yet. Not until they had solid evidence. But they were running out of time. The clock was ticking. It wasn't just the police officers Marcus had to worry about. He had learned that local politicians were involved, people he had worked with for years, people he thought he could trust. They had been complicit in covering up the corruption, using their power to keep it hidden from the public. One politician in particular, Councilman Greg Parks, was deeply connected to the police union. He had been funneling money into the police force, ensuring that officers like Hayes were never held accountable. Parks had the power to silence any investigation, and Marcus knew that if the investigation went any further, Parks would move quickly to shut it down. Parks is connected to Hayes, Marcus said, as he met with his team in the DA's office. He's part of this. If we go public with this, he'll pull every string he can to bury us. We need to be strategic. We can't let them discredit us. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that what they were up against was more dangerous than any case they'd ever handled. But they couldn't back down now. The truth had to come out no matter what the cost. As the days passed, the investigation reached a boiling point. Marcus and his team had compiled a mountain of evidence, everything from falsified reports to eyewitness testimonies. They were ready to go public. They were ready to expose the corruption that had been hidden for years. But the night before the press conference, Marcus received a threatening phone call. "You're playing with fire, Harper. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. You're about to learn just how powerful we really are." It was the voice of Councilman Parks. The threat was clear. If Marcus exposed the truth, his life would be ruined. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew the consequences. He was ready to take them on. He spent the night preparing his statement for the press conference, ensuring that every detail was airtight. He couldn't afford any mistakes. The system that had failed him and so many others would finally be exposed. The next morning, as Marcus stood in front of the cameras at the press conference, his phone buzzed. A text from Officer Sullivan. "They know. I can't do it. They've threatened my family. I'm backing out." Marcus's heart sank. Sullivan had caved. The pressure was too much, and the forces against them were too powerful. Marcus had counted on Sullivan's testimony, but now everything was falling apart. As the reporters began to shout questions, Marcus stepped forward, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His hands were shaking, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He had to make the call. "I'm going to expose everything," Marcus said, his voice steady, his eyes cold with determination. "No matter what happens." And just as he was about to make his statement, his phone rang again. It was Sarah, one of his closest allies. "Marcus, you need to get out of there. They've already mobilized." "It's too late." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. It had all come down to this moment. Marcus stood in front of the cameras, his eyes focused, his jaw clenched. The room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters shifting in their seats, cameras flashing, their questions hanging in the air like daggers. Behind him was a wall of evidence. Reports, photos, video footage, everything they needed to bring down Officer Hayes and the corrupt network he was a part of. For days, Marcus had been in the trenches, working around the clock with his trusted allies, gathering the truth from every angle. And now it was time to expose it. Today, we are taking a stand against the corruption that has run unchecked in our city for too long. Marcus began, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of emotion. For years, we've seen police officers abuse their power. For years, people of color have been targeted and harassed without reason. But today, that changes. His words echoed through the room, and Marcus felt a wave of resolve settle over him. This wasn't just about Officer Hayes anymore. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop or one traffic stop gone wrong. This was about the entire system that perpetuated injustice, that turned a blind eye to racial profiling, that treated people like him like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. We will not stand idly by and allow this system to continue. This investigation will hold everyone accountable, from the officer who initiated the harassment to the politicians who shielded him and the law enforcement agencies who ignored the warnings. The room went silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "But what about Officer Hayes? How will you hold him accountable?" the reporter asked. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself for the next phase of the story. "We have already begun the process. Officer Hayes will face disciplinary action. But this isn't just about him. This is about everyone who has allowed this behavior to persist. It's about holding those who have used their power to oppress others responsible for their actions." As Marcus wrapped up the press conference, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The system was fighting back, but so was he. The question was, who would win? Within hours of the press conference, the fallout began. Marcus was flooded with messages, some of support, others of veiled threats. The backlash from the police union was swift. They issued a statement condemning his actions, claiming he was making an example out of one officer to further his political career. "This is personal, Marcus," one of the messages read. "You've made a dangerous enemy. You're going to regret this." But for the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't feel the weight of fear. He felt empowered. He knew he was right. He had been the one who had stood on the front lines, protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. He had fought for justice his whole life, and now it was time for that justice to be served, no matter the cost. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of the investigation, he received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was Officer Hayes. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something close to regret, or maybe fear. He walked into Marcus' office without being invited, his badge still hanging from his belt. "I didn't mean for things to go this far," Hayes said, his voice quieter than Marcus had ever heard it. "I was just doing my job." Marcus stood up, his gaze unwavering. "No, Hayes, you were doing something else. You were abusing your power. You thought you could intimidate me because of the color of my skin, and you thought you could get away with it because no one was watching. But now the whole world is watching." For a brief moment, Hayes looked like he might argue, but instead, he sat down in the chair across from Marcus, his shoulders slumped. "I was wrong," Hayes admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that now, but I was following orders. I didn't realize who you were at first. I didn't know that pulling you over would lead to this. You're a powerful man. I didn't think this would escalate." Marcus felt a flicker of pity, but it was fleeting. The damage had been done. "You don't get to decide who gets treated fairly, Hayes," Marcus said, his voice hard. "That's not how this works. People like me don't get to be treated like this just because of the color of our skin. And you'll be held accountable." Marcus had already spoken with Internal Affairs and had begun the process of filing a formal complaint against Hayes. He knew the officer would face charges, but it wouldn't be enough. The system had to be reformed, not just one officer removed. But this was a start. The phone rang just as Marcus was preparing to leave for the night. It was Sarah, his trusted colleague, and the sound of urgency in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. "Marcus, we've got a problem. You won't believe this, but there's more to this than we thought. Hayes was just a pawn. Someone else is pulling the strings. It's bigger than we imagined." Marcus' heart skipped. He had already known this was just the beginning, but now the realization hit him harder than ever. He had uncovered one officer's corruption, but he was starting to realize just how far the tentacles of this network stretched. Hayes wasn't working alone. He was part of something much larger. "Who?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with the weight of the truth that was starting to unfold. "I don't have all the details yet," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "But we've uncovered some connections between Hayes and some very high-ranking political figures. We're talking about people who can make this whole thing go away. If you don't act fast, they'll bury us." Marcus stood in his office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead would be filled with danger, deceit, and threats. But Marcus had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of clarity in the chaos. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. He turned back to his desk, pulling up the evidence, preparing for the next steps. But just as he was about to make his next move, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "You've crossed a line, Marcus. You're playing with fire. We will make sure your life is destroyed. No one is untouchable. Marcus' stomach dropped. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a war against a corrupt system that had too much power to give up easily. He looked at the message one last time, the weight of it sinking in. He had no idea who was behind the threats, but he knew one thing. They weren't going to stop. Marcus wasn't backing down. He was just getting started.